Welcome to quidprosequo, where creativity meets academia. Here, we're all about leveraging our love of academia to improve both your creative writing practice and ours. Whether you're honing your craft or just beginning your writing journey, we're here to share scholarly insights, inspiration, and advice that benefits us all. Let's get started. Hi, and welcome to quidprosequo. I'm Rin.
And I'm Zac.
And today we are talking about genre stances for our Politics of Speculative Fiction series. But first, let's talk about our central question today, which is, are genres defined by political commitments? And first, we're going to start with some definitions, because, we love a definition here at Quid Pros Quo. And Zac, I'm going to let you take it away with the definitions.
Awesome. In the last episode, we gave some definitions for what politics are, so that you don't have to go back and, dig through that episode. We define politics as arguments about the organization of public life. And what we're talking about when we say political commitments are, in other words, ideologies about the way that we ought to relate to public life. So we're going to go through and set up 4 different political commitments. These are not meant to be exhaustive. They're not even really meant to be representative. But within the context of conversations about Western publishing, which is dominated by the United States and the UK, these are useful political commitments and ideologies to talk about in the context of how it interacts with what gets published and what doesn't. So let's start with conservatism. We're defining conservatism as a political commitment to preserving public life as it is. This is part of the reason why conservatives are called conservatives, is because they are suspicious of new developments, because conservatives can point to different historical examples where new developments have been messy and chaotic and violent, and they want to preserve what works, or what they think works. And you see how the name for the ideology follows from that commitment to hold on to the status quo. We have liberalism, which is a political commitment to changing public life to better reflect a particular conception of the good life. So liberalism is not going to be a coherent set of anything, because the conception of a good life is going to be different from person to person, and is going to be different from group to group. And so liberalism is a lot more fractured in that sense, because we're moving in different directions to move towards something better. Next, we're going to talk about revolutionary political commitments. And this is a political commitment to returning to how public life used to be. So back then, public life was one way, we changed it, now we're here, and we want to go back to that prior way. Why use revolution to talk about this? Or in this sense? Because oftentimes when we talk about revolution, we are talking about some kind of violent lurch in some sort of direction, into the future, right? And the reason why we're using revolutionary inside of this state is because it suggests the arc of a wheel, and the idea that history turns like a wheel, the wheel of time, right? This is a definition that I was first introduced to inside of my American history textbook, City Upon a Hill, 3rd edition by Fox and Pope. And we're using that same definition here in order to talk about this particular ideology. And then lastly, we have authoritarianism. And authoritarianism is a political commitment that seeks to define public life on the basis of loyalty to an individual or organization. Perhaps you are living under a rock and you need me to describe that we are living inside of a very tumultuous time where authoritarianism is on the rise across the world. Specifically inside of the United States, there are lots of concerns about authoritarianism and how it is being manifested inside of our public life. And so we're putting it in here as well to add to the mix. The important thing about these these definitions is that they don't map well onto how we might use these terms in everyday parlance. So, for example, some wings of the Republican Party are better described as authoritarian than conservative, and some sectors of the Democratic Party are conservative rather than liberal. It just kind of depends on who specifically you're looking at and what their individual commitment is, despite the fact that they belong to the same political party.
Right, because no group is a monolith, political or otherwise. So, nuance, which is, again, the name of the game for this series. So, let's dive right into the genre stances as we perceive them. And, again, we're not a monolith. We are not necessarily totally right on these. But we're going to give you our interpretations of these genre stances. And you're welcome to discuss this with us politely in the comments, or you can send us an email at quidprosequo@gmail.com, but we're not going to engage with rage bait because
life is too short, okay?
Life is too short
for trolls.
No, literally. So let's dive right in with romance, which is one of my favorite genres, as I was very clear last episode. We believe that most brands of romance are liberal or revolutionary, where revolutionary romance is like romance, like very much Hallmark movie where they give up a corporate life in favor of a small town. So it harkens back to a time before corporatization. Wow, can't say that word. Which is what makes it revolutionary by the definition we presented early in the episode. So, like, Hallmark is revolutionary, not in the way you were expecting, though, I'm sure. Liberal romances are those that envision a world where love can exist without interference from the public. Paranormal and monster romances, or romances between social classes and status-conscious societies, are good examples of liberal romances, where love is something that's public because it includes the smallest possible group, not popular group, but it should not be publicly interfered with. And romances are usually set up that social norms or other people are the obstacles to be overcome. So think of like, I'm reading Emily Henry right now. I'm not very far into the people we meet on vacation. It's the penultimate Emily Henry book I have left to read. I also need to read Great Big Beautiful Life, whatever her newest one is.
Yeah.
But a lot of like Emily Henry books, it's like people overcoming either someone who says you shouldn't be with this person or like societal norms. Like I think in Book Lovers, the main obstacle is like there are different publishing houses and they're like, we can't, or they're playing different roles in the publishing industry and they like, it's a book industry love book. For those of you who haven't read Book Lovers, but it's, you know, they're trying to overcome almost a Romeo and Juliet situation where it's like the families say it can't be this way and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I think when we think about the kinds of conflicts that are usually present inside of the romance genre, it makes sense for them to fall inside of these buckets. Because if we were to try and think about a conservative romance where we're talking about some kind of, holding on to the way that life currently is, in many respects, when it comes to romance, you can't really set that up unless it's a romance in which one person is being tempted to cheat and it is ultimately deciding whether they want to stay with the person that they're already with, which I just describe that to you and you're like, that doesn't sound like a romance, that's because it's not. It's a literary fiction novel, right? We would expect to find that in like the Nobel Prize for literature or in a literature class or something.
For sure. Because if it's a conservative romance, they're trying to keep things the way they are, but usually romances are about like falling in love and changing for the better.
Yes.
So like it doesn't mesh, it doesn't make sense.
I would be really curious about like an authoritarian romance where I don't even know how you would set that up. Maybe it would be
like sports romance where like you fall in love on the basis of loyalty to like a team. Are sports romances authoritarian? I've never ever read a sports romance.
Neither have I, so we're just kind of shooting in the dark here.
Again, please leave your thoughts respectfully in the comments.
Yeah, if you've read a sports romance, let's chat about this because we're really curious.
I could not tell you. Sports romances are not my jam. I have friends who write sports romances. I'll DM them after we record this episode. I'm like, so tell me. Anyways, next up, we're going to talk about horror, which is not my favorite genre, as opposed to romance, which is a great genre in my opinion. Horror is also a great genre, but I did just decline like reading a horror romance's first chapter because I was like, I can't do all those trigger warnings. The trigger warning list scared me.
Well,
but
kudos to you for recognizing with the trigger warnings that was like, you know what, I'm not going to read this.
Right, like I said I would read it, and then I'm like, wait, what is like the genre? They're like, horror romance. I'm like, I'm sorry, what? And they're like, oh yeah, let me go get the trigger warning list. And I was like,
it's
maybe
interesting that they said horror romance rather than dark romance. Is that because it's like horror and there's a romance subplot, or
I think it's a horror with a romance subplot. Let me pull up that like trigger warning list because it was a lot. Anyways, horror, we are so far off the track. Yes. It is a genre typically conservative in nature, which because it draws on metaphors that reflect current anxieties. So like when you portray these anxieties as something foreign and terrifying, it's a really conservative reflex. You want things to stay the way they are. You don't want them to change. You don't want to give into these anxieties.
Yeah, so there is a lot of really interesting literature about how how tropes of different horror monsters can kind of bubble up and then go back down depending on what is going on inside of the broader society. So you've seen this with like zombies, you've seen it with vampires. The specific examples that I'm aware of have to do with religious othering, where the idea of, a religious group sending out missionaries and then, having people actually be interested in it can fall under the guise of like vampiricism with, what's it called? Mind control or something like that, which reflects anxieties about changing religious makeup inside of a society. But there are other examples that you could look at as well. Sometimes you see this cutting in the opposite direction, where what is foreign or terrifying is the past. There are some really good examples of, horror that's based around racism or sexism, where what is horrifying are attitudes that currently existed in the past, and kind of using horror to drive people in the opposite direction. And then I would say that there's a third category of horror, which is horrors that draw on perennial anxieties, which are part of being human. And in my estimation, these are apolitical because the unconscious is not a subject of politics because it's not public, right? You hear, Jung had the idea of the collective unconscious, but the collective unconscious is not something that is changeable in the sense that we can think about changing it, because then it would be conscious, not unconscious.
Right.
I think Alien is a really good example of this because it's so rooted in violating the male taboo around bodily integrity, where men like to think of themselves as being self-contained and not having things stuck in them, right? So to have a monster that deposits its eggs inside of your chest and it explodes, or the face huggers or things like that, is based in a particular aspect of psychology and the way that men think. that it doesn't really fall under politics in that sense, right?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I just don't like horror. This, like, you were talking Alien, which I've never seen because I don't do well with horror. Ugh, I hate that. I'm so sorry. Let's move on to another genre that I like more.
Yeah, let's do it.
Science fiction. We tend to think of science fiction as a super liberal genre where we're always like about progress and like advancing towards the good life. But there are subsets of science fiction that are conservative as a rule. But let's start with liberal science fiction. Like I said, science fiction is often imagining better worlds enabled by technology or progress as the author defines it. This idea of historical progress is largely a byproduct of Christianity in Western Europe. And also in the Americas, I think, where without the immense influence of Christianity, this idea of an end to history doesn't make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I see this a lot in, like, I feel like space exploration sci-fi very much falls into this category where it's like manifest destiny across the galaxy, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and then you get into like lots of other fun political ideas like, ooh, should we be colonizing other planets? Is colonialism an appropriate thing to do to indigenous peoples of those planets?
Yeah.
Lots of fun questions to ask. And sci-fi is a great, like, vessel for dealing with those kinds of issues. Like we said in the first episode of this series, if you root an experience in a story, you're more likely to be able to connect with people over it. So maybe they're not going to, like, see issues with, like, colonialism in the real world, but they're like, oh wow, look at colonialism in this sci-fi novel. It can, like, lead to conversation about, like, oh, that's actually based on the true story, that we don't know, like, the full story of the indigenous peoples that were colonized because they were colonized.
Right. So I read a book quite a while ago called The Invention of Human Rights. I remember that I think the author's name was Linda Hunt. And in the book, she talks about how the invention of human rights as like a concept inside of Enlightenment Europe corresponded with the development of novels inside of the European literary circle, where people were so drawn in with empathy for the characters of the book that it inspired empathy for them to be like, maybe we shouldn't be disemboweling criminals. Maybe.
No more drawing and quartering.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fascinating thesis. And I think that it's a compelling thesis because there is psychological research to show that people who read novels are often, they're exercising the capacity for empathy more than people who are not, who aren't reading in that way that requires them to put themselves in somebody else's shoes. So I do think you're right that science fiction can often be one of those ways in order to, take a little step here and then move over to another step over there. A few weeks ago, I was reading Alien Clay by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And I love Tchaikovsky. I love all of his books. Basically anything he writes, I'm like, I'm there. Sign me up. And so I sat down to read this, and it's about a biologist who is exiled to a work camp on another planet because he questioned political orthodoxy on Earth. And I was like, whoa, I was not ready to be called out so hard. Like sitting in my bed, just trying to do a little bit of reading before I go to sleep.
Super light reading there, Zach.
My wife does make fun of, she teases me. She does not make fun of me. She teases me by saying, do you ever like read anything that isn't super heavy? Because I'm like sitting over here reading like the collection of anarchist essays and a history of history of the development of the internet and some theology over there. And she's like, do you ever just like read something light, and I'm like, yes, I read books with you that are light, where we read about superpowered teenagers or talking mice. I love the talking mice stories. They're my favorite. They're
really cute. They're not what?
They're not science fiction, though, as a rule. You can have science fiction stories with talking mice.
Right. I just want to say, as a side note, I think we really, every couple of episodes, I feel like you bring up Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is so funny because I remember when you were Children of Time and you brought it to me, like, this is the best book. And we talked about it on the podcast when you read it.
Yes.
And every couple of months now, you've just come up with another Tchaikovsky book, which I love that. We're chronicling your love of Tchaikovsky through the ages on Quid Pro Quo. Okay, we gotta get back to this, though. So let's talk about conservative science fiction. So this is science fiction based on warnings about this or that technology. And this always makes me think of that one meme. It's it's a tweet and it's tech company today. We, at long last, we have finally created the Torment Nexus from the science fiction novel. Do not create the Torment Nexus.
Yes.
Yeah, so conservative sci-fi are tales like that, and it's some examples. It's Dune as it pertains to AI, or Jurassic Park as it pertains to the entirety of Jurassic Park, genetic cloning and the limits of limits and air quotes of science and what we should do with science.
Mm-hmm,
Those are two examples. Also, military sci-fi, which is a very big popular subgenre of sci-fi, is conservative because it's often about military action against that which is alien or other, which also can, I suppose, lend itself to horror, but I don't know enough about horror to have that conversation, I'm not gonna lie.
Well, yeah, sometimes they overlap because if you have... So I think a good example as to kind of encapsulate this is Ender's Game, because not specifically Ender's Game being a horror book, because it's not, but in Ender's Game, the entire setup is that the humans have to defend themselves against the Formics, which are the bugs, right? And we as humans don't, at least in the West, don't really like bugs, and bugs kind of wig us out. And so the bugs are that which is alien or other, and it's only at the end of the book that that you see somebody developing empathy for the Formics, which is part of the reason why it's such a great book, is because of that growth and progression on Ender's part to get to that point. A lot of people who are writing military sci-fi today are less interested in that because moral complexity doesn't sell, right? People just want to read, Space Marines blowing shit up, and that's fine.
Avatar, the Blue People movie.
So, it's just taste, and it has a different political commitment and probably has different political value as well.
For sure. That was low-key flipping the Avatar, the Blue People movie, but because there is some moral complexity in Avatar, but they didn't do it as well in The Way of Water as they did in the first one. And even then, the first one is morally dubious in my opinion because it's white saviorism. But anyways, fantasy.
Yeah. Fantasy. All right.
Our favorites.
Here we go.
So, romantasy is a liberal genre for many of the same reasons why romance is liberal. But epic fantasy is often and generally revolutionary. The Inklings, who are J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, they're writing group, thought of their works as returning to an older tradition, medievalism, and not preserving what currently is. Which is why we get so much fantasy that's just medieval Europe. Which is okay.
Yeah.
It just gets a little boring after thousands and thousands and thousands of books published in medieval Europe. And that's another reason why the Own Voices movement is so popular and so important right now. I think because there are more places than just medieval Europe.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Dark Ages were only dark in Europe, as the historians like to say.
Yeah. I think one of the other things with epic fantasy in this case is that even sometimes authors that we think about with some of the more liberal authors that we think about, so my mind goes to Ursula Le Guin. Le Guin wanted to use the language of myth in order to advance a critique of what the good life should look like and what society ought to look like. So in that way, you can have liberal fantasy, but oftentimes liberal fantasy uses that mythological worldview in order to make those critiques. So it becomes more nuanced and complicated than just saying it's this or it's that.
For sure. And if you want to do some really good, interesting Le Guin reading, we both recently read her essay collection, Language of the Night,
Yes.
which they did like a republication of since its original. I can't remember the dates on these publications, but like it was originally published in like the late 70s or early 80s, and then they did another one a decade or two later.
Mm-hmm.
And the essays in them were like amazing and insanely good because like Le Guin is just so cool.
Yeah.
But we both really enjoyed it. We thought about doing a book club for like our roundtable discussion on that, and then we decided it was too hard to get other people to read the book because we are learning it's really hard to read a book on schedule. If
oh no.
I'm sorry to the last indie author who has not gotten their review yet. That is my fault, and I am so sorry. It will be done in the next week or two, probably, but I can't even guarantee that at this point. Anyways, let's talk about punk genres like steampunk, cyberpunk, so on and so forth.
Yes.
Anything solar punk, all those fun things.
Mm-hmm.
They're generally organized around skepticism. That's a word. I said it and I was like, that did not sound right coming out of my mouth. Punk genres are generally organized around skepticism towards organizations, and in that way they're anti-authoritarian. But because punk stories are often about how life sucks and how people deal with life sucking, it's not really a liberal piece of media. And of course there are obsessions like Arcane, the TV show based on the League of Legends game.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a liberal piece of media.
Yeah.
And like, I'm in the middle of the Monk and Robot duology by Becky Chambers. The first one is a psalm for the wild built, and the second is a prayer for the crown shy. And I've heard that described as solar punk.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it's very much about like making life better. So I would definitely argue Monk and Robot series is liberal media.
Yeah.
And it's so good.
I think that solar punk as a genre is a lot more optimistic than some of the steampunk and cyberpunk can be. And
for sure.
I think in that sense, solar punk often trends towards like liberalism, where it's moving towards a better future and, steps to achieve that future. Where especially with cyberpunk, it's like we have arrived in the future and life sucks in the future because of X, Y, or Z thing, right?
No, for sure.
Which kind of gets wrapped up, is kind of a similar thing that happens in grimdark. I have learned that grimdark is not for me because I read a grimdark book and I realized that I was just so exhausted by it. And part of grimdark is this belief that public life is absurd, that it doesn't matter. It's not inherently moral in and of itself. There isn't any moral truth to how public life is supposed to be organized. It's, kill or be killed. This is like Song of Ice and Fire, like the Game of Thrones series is very much based inside of this sort of pessimistic, absurdist way of thinking about public life. And if you believe that about public life, there's no critique beyond that, right? Because there isn't any meaning to be derived or any value to be derived beyond that, right?
If life is meaningless, you cannot find meaning in a critique.
Yes.
those are the speculative genres we picked out for this, and we are coming up on time. So here's your homework. Do you agree or disagree with our assessments? If you agree, give us an example of how you would characterize the political commitment of a story you like. If you disagree, do the same and show us what we overlooked. We'd love to hear from you. Again, comment in the comments on YouTube, on Spotify, on Substack. You can send us an email at quidprosequo@gmail.com. Spell it right and it should get to us.
Yeah.
But that's all we've got for you today. In 2 weeks, next time we see you, we will be talking about institutional versus grassroots politics in books, which will be a really fun topic, and I'm excited to get to that episode. We'll see you next time on Quid Pros Quo.
Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and CK Jensen. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosequo@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today.